the bloodiest and most costly wars ever fought. It is estimated that over 11 million soldiers and 8 million civilians died during the war. This does not include the millions of wounded and permanently disabled. The war cost over $337 billion. Horrific memories of the war and the loss of national treasure it consumed would shape the geopolitical landscape for the next 20 years and guarantee that the war to end all wars would be the precursor of an even larger conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war in Europe and outlined the terms of peace. Key terms of the treaty included the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. Germany had to accept blame for starting the war. Germany was required to pay $31.4 billion in war reparations. Loss of territory. The size and capability of the Navy was restricted to 6 battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 torpedo boats, or an equal number of ships. No submarines were permitted. An air force was not permitted. The war decimated opponents on both sides. Inflation and economic depression took its toll on a global scale. The Treaty of Versailles was written in favor of the victorious nations, while imposing harsh conditions on Germany. These harsh conditions would cause bitter resentment amongst the Germans, fueling their desire to rearm. When Hitler denounced the disarmament clauses of the Treaty of Versailles on March 16, 1935, he revealed his determination to achieve the single-minded goal of reclaiming all that Germany had lost during World War I, whatever the cost. Money was no object as Hitler set out to rearm Germany with military investments, nearly bankrupting the country several times during the 1930s. Through vigorous conscription of a very large population, Hitler felt confident that the size of the Wehrmacht army could be increased from 300,000 to over 500,000 men. Germany believed the Wehrmacht would prevail because of its vast size, excellent coordination, and singular purpose. Because Germany had scuttled their weaponry and equipment after World War I, they were unburdened by obsolescence. They could forge ahead to incorporate new technological advances into a new, reimagined military. The Germans made a smart choice to build multi-purpose aircraft when they developed the Luftwaffe fleet. These planes were built pre-war, such as the Messerschmitt fighters and Junker dive and medium bombers, were well designed and resulted in a finished product superior to those of other nations. Up until this point, foot soldiers determined the pace of the war, but now the sustained mobility of the German panzer divisions would control the tempo. Unlike soldiers marching, a panzer tank could cover over 50 miles or more in a day in and day out. Working in formation, panzer divisions could make brutal strikes, targeted fast and deep into enemy territory. The radios in every tank and vehicle were an indispensable German military innovation, allowing more accurate coordination of forces on land and in the air. One shining German artillery success was the very effective 88mm anti-tank and aircraft gun. The development of the German Navy would not come as easily. After Germany and Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935, allowing Germany to possess 1/3 of the British Navy's surface and submarine fleet, Hitler was slow to ramp up efforts to build his navy. Shipbuilding is a time-consuming process, and major investments would be needed to get the shipyards and other plants up to speed. While Germany developed a new vision for its military, the British were slow to rearm and review their war methodology in order to prepare for future hostilities. While Britain began the 1930s with an established military, the country's main desire was not to repeat the horrors of the war. Delaying rearmament would help the country stabilize the economy and keep a tight grasp on a balanced national budget. Leaders and civilians alike wanted to avoid the human and monetary costs of once again deploying thousands of ground troops into mainland Europe. In 1935, the Treasury allocated funds for rearmament that went mostly to the Royal Navy and Air Force to use for defending the homeland. The Royal Air Force had a large number of planes in 1939, but unlike Germany's production that incorporated standardized components, many British planes in the fleet were becoming obsolete. At the end of the decade, the English were producing just one modern fighter plane, the Hurricane. The better model, the Spitfire, was just coming into production at the time. The British were very concerned about protecting military and civilian targets on land from the threat of bomber attacks. They developed networks of radar stations that could detect the location, distance, and speed of approaching enemy aircraft. The Royal Navy, the largest in the world in 1939, was the main strength of the British military. At the time, the fleet consisted of 15 battleships, 7 aircraft carriers, 66 cruisers, 184 various types of destroyers, 60 submarines, and 45 escort and patrol vehicles. France emerged victorious from World War I, but it took a heavy toll on the country. This would greatly impact it in the years leading up to World War II and affect its rearmament. France ranked third in World War I amongst the warring nations in deaths. 1.3 million soldiers were killed. The French military leaders did not use their victory in World War I as an opportunity to look to the future, embracing new strategies and technologies. Instead, faced with budget restraints imposed by large debts from World War I and economic depression, the French military tried to save funds by using as much of the tremendous stockpile of weapons left from World War I that they could. The French realized the geographical threat of needing to be able to defend against attack and the ability to fight a war on its own soil. The French relied on both the French regulars and use of conscription to quickly mobilize larger groups of forces as needed. The French also directed funding in the interwar years to constructing and maintaining a series of defensive concrete fortifications along its border with Germany called the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line became the critical piece around which the French would focus their defensive plans in case of attack. French military leaders recognized the potential of a German attack. They prepared for a long war in which they could use the Maginot Line defensively to stop the Germans at the border and wear them down. The French Air Force was weak and ill-equipped, as the French produced few planes when it modernized their stock after the 1920s. Daladier was told in 1938 that the French Air Force would be wiped out within 2 weeks of war with Germany. The French Navy was also in a position similar to the Air Force due to lack of funding. France's rearmament failed because military leaders planned to refight the same type of strategic war they fought in World War I. German displeasure with the components of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles simmered for years. The war guilt clause, demands for reparations, and the loss of territory did not sit well with the proud Germans, and they soon began to work in secret to defy the military restrictions laid out in the document. In contrast, both France and Britain failed to entertain new ideas and methods, instead focusing on paying off their World War I debts and balancing their budgets. In France, considerable funds were spent on bolstering the army, while British rearmament funds instead went to the Royal Navy and Air Force. France and Britain each took on defensive postures, with the French constructing concrete fortifications of the Maginot Line and the British setting up their radar defense system. As fighting broke out, Britain and France were left with no choice but to fight. They would have to quickly adapt their defensive postures of rearmament and adapt strategies to counter those of Germany.